Hello, so it's been a while. I haven't updated you on my reading for a bit because I haven't really been reading apart from all of these. So I have been reading, but it's mostly been university stuff. When I read for university, I'm not reading for like reviewing purposes. I'm not reading for enjoyment. I'm reading so I can talk about it with other people and possibly write an essay on it. So often I don't have much to say about books that I read for university, and often also they're books that I wouldn't normally choose to read, so it's not like I'm able to recommend them to people. Anyway, all that being said, I am gonna do a little catch up basically on what I've been reading, so take you through all the books that I've read in October, November and the first kind of couple of weeks of December, which is where we are now. So it's quite a lot to get through, as I said. So first up, I'm just going to run through quite quickly all of the books that I read for university. Most of these I've already talked about in my uni book haul, but obviously at that point I hadn't read them, so I didn't really know at all what they were about, but now I do because I have read most of them. The first one I read way back in October was Death and the King's Horseman by Wole Soyinka. This is based on a real event that happened, so it follows the events after the horseman of a dead Yoruba king is meant to undergo a kind of ritual suicide to help him help the dead king move into the afterlife. However, the British colonial officials get all mixed up in this and they don't want it to happen, and it kind of, it follows what happens with this kind of situation. In class we looked at this in terms of how culture can be used to resist colonialism, but it's also a classic kind of tragedy of internal conflict, and yeah, it's one that I would like to see a performance of. I didn't get loads from just reading it, but I think it is a really interesting play. Next up I read Kanthapura by Raja Rao. This is about a fictional village in the south of India, and the kind of journey that all the people who live in the village go on in becoming kind of followers of Gandhi, and it was written around the same kind of time that it's set, I think. Yeah, so it was first published in 1938, so it's a pre-independence novel. It follows this entire village, which is really interesting because you don't just get like one character, you get a whole village and kind of finding their national identity and the kind of unity that brings them together. It looks at anti-colonialism and lots of different things that intersect with it, like gender, caste, religion, language, all kinds of stuff. The next book I read was a book called Nazi Empire by Shelley Baranowski. I had to read this for a history class. I had to do a book review about on a book about totalitarianism, and I chose that one. It was not the most cheerful book I've ever read. It's a historian's book, it's dense as fuck, it's about totalitarianism and empire, and it's very depressing, and also her argument isn't very strong. Wouldn't recommend. There you go. But I read it. It counts towards my Goodreads goal. Next up I read The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. This is a kind of, classic piece of literary fiction. It's, it was like very, very hyped up at the time that it came out. And yeah, I actually really enjoyed reading this. I think it's really difficult to describe because it doesn't really have a plot. It kind of looks at events that happen to a family from lots of different perspectives and points in time and kind of the after effects of these events. The writing is stunning, like it's some of the best writing I've ever read. The last chapter of this is genuinely a masterpiece in itself, I think. Yeah, that being said, a lot of it did go over my head. Lots of the kind of things that she was doing just went whoof, and that's fine. Like, I know that I had a feeling when I was reading this that like this is a book that I'm going to return to, and that my relationship with it will develop over time, and I will read it again and gain new things from it, and I just kind of, I have a feeling that this is just the beginning of a long relationship with this book. Don't know if that's true, but that's the feeling I get. Anyway, yeah, this was one I actually did enjoy reading. Then I read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This again is a sort of classic, you know, kind of canonical text of like mid 20th century science fiction, and it was a lot more my kind of thing than I expected it to be, which was interesting. It's never been one that I've like had an urge to pick up. This is set in a world where books are outlawed, and if you have books in your house, the firemen will come along and burn them all, which, you know, obviously is like pretty nightmarish, and also it's, you know, it's quite clearly about like the value of reading, but not in a really like clear-cut books are amazing all the time kind of way, which I wasn't expecting, and is interesting and is what I'm currently writing an essay about. As in like right now. I should be writing my essay right now, but I'm not. It follows one of these firemen and his kind of process of questioning everything that's going on, basically. The characters in this are not in any way real people. They're just not, like, they don't feel real, especially the women, but it does have some really interesting, vivid writing in it that I wasn't expecting. I don't know, I seem to remember like things like 1984 are written in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. This is actually a lot more lyrical than I thought it would be, which I enjoyed. This next book I did actually really enjoy. This is The Well of Loneliness by Radclyffe Hall. This follows Stephen. She is a woman, and her parents really hoped for and expected her to be a boy, and essentially it's about her journey figuring out that she's a lesbian and just living through the discrimination that she suffers as a woman and as a gay woman, in the kind of late 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century. So you follow her through her kind of aristocratic childhood, and then into the First World War, and then into the 1920s, where she goes to Paris. I just really enjoyed reading this. I got so into it. Felt like I really knew all the characters, and it's very sad, obviously. Like, it's all about how shit being a lesbian is in the, like, you know, early 20th century, but I just thought it was great. There are some really, really like racist moments in this book, which obviously you can't look past, and did like proper spoil it for me, but other than that, it's a good one, and I think it holds a really important place in kind of literary history, I guess. Yeah, and women's history and LGBTQ plus history too. Another good read is A Small Place by Jamaica Kincaid. I really enjoyed this. Well, maybe enjoyed isn't the best word, but this is great. Like, it's so good. It's basically a long essay, kind of in different parts, about Antigua and the kind of legacies of colonialism in Antigua, and neo-colonialism, and especially it looks at these things through kind of the impact of the tourism industry, and essentially just tears it all apart. It's unforgiving, it's confronting, it's very powerful, and you will be called out by this book, but it is incredibly important, and I'm really glad that I've read it. We're almost at the end of the university books. Next I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. This was a reread for me. I read this a few years ago and loved it so much. It's one of my all-time favourite classics, favourite books. I love it. I didn't enjoy it as much this time around because I was reading for a deadline and all that kind of stuff, and reading for university just kind of messes with my head anyway, so yeah, I didn't like enjoy the experience of this, but I still think it is an excellent book. Just briefly, it is about a young beautiful man in the late let me get this right this time, late 19th century in London, and essentially he's very rich, he's very beautiful. His friend paints a portrait of him, and he goes, "If only I could never grow old and that picture could grow old instead of me," and then that's what happens. Yeah, it's very dark, it's very mysterious, it's very tense, it's very gothic. all the things I love, basically. The writing is just incredibly extravagant and beautiful. It's so dark and so creepy, and I love it. Last university book I read was This Earth of Mankind by Pramoedya and Ananta. This by this point in the semester my brain was essentially mush, and I did not really appreciate this book. It's about a young boy in Indonesia in the late 19th century. I'm paranoid about that now. Basically it's about his kind of development from being the kind of perfect colonial subject, like he admires everything Dutch, he speaks very good Dutch, he is convinced that kind of, you know, Europe is like the epitome of progress in innovation and civilization. But yeah, so he goes from this point to then recognising the value of Indonesian culture and Indonesian nationalism, I guess. Like I said, I didn't love this, but I read it, it was interesting, and it was about, I learned a lot about the time and place that I didn't know anything about before. So now we're on to the books that I actually read for myself in the last few months. First up, we have The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This is the story of an old, very famous fictional writer who, at the end of her life, decides that, after being very secretive for her whole life, she decides at the very end that she wants to give her biography to a kind of young, low-profile biographer. And yeah, and it basically follows her giving her life story and giving the story of her family. It's slow, it's still very gripping, and it's incredibly mysterious. It's got a great old house, it's got twins, it's got creepy family shenanigans, it's got drama. Yeah, this book has everything that I love. The writing is beautiful, the atmosphere is excellent, and I read it at the perfect time for that. It was like very October-y, kind of, you know, leaves and shit. It was all good. And I think my one kind of qualm with this was I didn't love the ending. Like, I really enjoyed the process of reading it, but like the ending wasn't the kind of, it felt like it was building up to something, and that didn't quite like, it didn't like blow me away in any way. It took me a while to be like, huh, what's going on here? So yeah, that was like the only thing that I didn't love about it, essentially. I still thought it was a good ending, like plot-wise, but it didn't like build up to this kind of amazing finale that I was kind of expecting from the tension and everything. But anyway, solid, creepy, autumnal read. Yeah, really enjoyed. I then finished Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, which I listened to on audiobook. This wasn't a book that I was like desperate to get to. I wanted some YA because obviously, you know, reading lots of stuff for uni, I wasn't really in the mood for like deep shit, essentially. So I just wanted some YA fantasy that I could just like get into and go. And this was perfect for like that. It was exactly what I wanted. It was immersive, it was funny, it had lots of endearing characters that I could kind of you know, get invested in. I love the urban fantasy setting, and reading about kind of thieves and murderers and shit like that in a, you know, nasty city. I'm all up for that. It's about a criminal gang of mostly 17-year-olds, and I'm like, you guys are so young. I know I'm only 20, but still, I'm like, if I was doing this shit when I was 17, like, I was incapable. Anyway, it's about a criminal gang, and they are challenged to pull off this near impossible heist, and break into a really secure place, essentially. And it's great, it's really fun. The book is narrated from all the different characters' perspectives, which I love. The audiobook had different narrators for each different character, which was great. And yeah, just made me feel really, really immersed, and I really enjoyed it. It was a good time, and I'm excited to read the second one. I then read the one book that was on my kind of Halloween fantasy TBR, which was Revenge by Yoko Ogawa. This is a collection of short stories. They're very eerie. All of them are eerie. Some of them are just kind of weird, and some of them are really quite gory. And yeah, this is my third book that I've read by Yoko Ogawa. I love her writing, and that hasn't changed from this book, even though this is my least favourite of hers that I've read so far. The short stories are all kind of interconnected, but I didn't feel like that did anything for it, really. As with all short story collections, and there were ones in this that I really, really loved, and others that haven't really stuck with me at all. Overall, it was just kind of fine. I think because I prefer Yoko Ogawa's style in longer form a lot more. I think this is one that I might go back to because, like I said, I love Yoko Ogawa as a writer. I still love the style of these, and I think it's really unique, and I think I might get more out of it if I read it at a different time. The next book I finished was The Doll Factory by Elizabeth Macneal. I loved this book. I was so obsessed with it. This book was exactly what I needed at the right time, similar to Six of Crows. At the time when I read this, I wanted something kind of dark, what's new, something that would really get me invested and just transport me to another world, and that's exactly what this did. Like, it delivered. It's set in the 1850s in London. I love historical London any kind of time as a setting. I love the kind of grittiness and the darkness, and that really came through in this book, but also because it follows a young woman who wants to become a painter, and she gets sort of caught up in the world of the pre-Raphaelites, and yeah, so you get the kind of grittiness of London, but you also get the sort of grandeur and innovation and artistic world too, which was great, and I really loved how those two things existed at the same time. I got so invested in the characters in this book. Like, I mean, I love them so much. Like, I really loved them, but also it was the kind of book where I was just desperate for everything to turn out okay. I was like, please just let these people be happy. I was so tense in the last third. I had to stop reading several times and just have a little scream into a pillow, a little wiggle around with just tension. It was a wonderful experience. This is the kind of book that I read historical fiction for, and it reminded me of The Mermaid and Mrs. Hancock, which I read at the very beginning of this year, and also kind of made me feel like this. Yeah, top notch, loved it. I did have a little minor thing at the time that stopped me giving it 5 stars, but I honestly can't remember what it was. So we're almost there, folks. My feet hurt. I finished 2 books yesterday, actually. One of them was the audiobook of Lady in Waiting by Anne Glenconner, which was wild. It's the autobiography, memoir, I guess, of Anne Glenconner, who was Lady in Waiting to Princess Margaret for a long time, and also just a remarkable woman in her own right. Like, she had a mad life. There are so many ups and downs and so many emotional extremes that is just fascinating to read about. Obviously there's lots of kind of secrets and insight into the British aristocracy and the royal family, and the kind of life that sort of elite leads, which is a wild life. Again, like, my god, it's so good. But there's also stories of, you know, very human grief and just struggle, albeit from a very, like, extremely privileged, exceptional position. But it's really interesting to read about the kind of human stories of grief and family troubles from that kind of perspective. And lastly, out of this big old bunch of books, I read The Wych Elm by Tana French. I finished this late last night. I actually stayed up to finish it, only till like 11, because I'm an old woman at heart, and yeah, it was gripping and just great. I love this a lot more than I was expecting to, actually, because lots of the reviews are quite sort of mediocre, even for people who love Tana French's writing. Yeah, I've seen quite mixed reviews, but I really enjoyed this. So this follows Toby, who is a very normal, middle class, lucky, as he calls it, privileged Irish man, and he is lucky until he has a really horrible accident at the very beginning of this book, and yeah, and then that kind of leaves him with PTSD and in a very vulnerable kind of physical state. He's still recovering from this attack when there is a skull found in a large elm tree in his uncle's house, which is where he spent a lot of his childhood, and from there the shit hits the fan, and it keeps hitting it. This is a kind of crime thriller novel, but it's so unique in that the narrator can't trust himself, because he has memory problems. He's had, you know, a really bad head injury and can't remember lots of things, but he also feels like he can't trust anyone that's around him. This is a really long book, but that is because the characters are so fleshed out and three-dimensional, and just their relationships are gone, like, examined in such detail. The dialogue on this is so natural, it's incredible. Like, yeah, it just felt like I was reading about real people. It was amazing. I don't know if the representation of PTSD and disability is accurate in this book, but the experience of anxiety, like extreme anxiety, and like shame around physical disability and not wanting people to know how terrible the main character feels, Toby feels, that is all written so well and so kind of vividly, and I haven't really ever read anything about that like before. Basically, yeah, Tana French can write, like, damn, girl can write, and she can write characters, she can write an amazingly well plotted story, and yeah, essentially Grace from GK Reads, who always goes on about Tana French, you were right. And this was a good one, solid. So yeah, that's been the last 2 and a bit months of reading for me. It's been intense. It's been a long term, but it's mostly over now. I'm just writing a lot of essays. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope that my thoughts were somehow helpful to you. I don't know why they would be, but here we are. Yeah, anyway, I'll see you soon. I've got pins and needles in my foot,